Thank you very much. It's great to be here at Casual Connect. Just a quick show of hands. How many folks here in the audience are currently working on a learning game or have worked on learning games, just to get an idea? Okay, good amount. Well, as John mentioned, I'm Scott Traylor, and I've founded 360 Kid 21 years ago. This is just some of the new stuff I've got going on right now. We just launched our new website on Monday, still fine-tuning a little bit. And currently we're knee-deep in lots of game development for My Little Pony, which is a whole nother, I could tell you stories. It's quite a ride. Have been involved in a lot of educational work, believe it or not, with Pokemon. And we're now just getting ready to release some of our own educational apps in the coming months. With that as a background, everything about my business has been working with kids and preferably learning. There's been lots of twists and turns in the industries, plural, over the last few years about learning games and learning content in general. But I'll try to share some of the observations I have and insights and recommendations and so forth. I have a number of slides that kind of fall into 4 different categories here: the size of the market, trends in apps, industries and learning games, and some learning game development tips, things that I've noted over the years. So just to get started with size of the market. One of the interesting things is nobody ever really talks about, well, how many kids are there here in the US and how many of them might be interested or of school age interested in learning games. So I tried to pull together some numbers, and just enough data is out to share what the size of the youth population is within the US, as well as how many public schools and teachers and so forth. If you think about it, every child from 0 to 17, every teacher, every school could possibly be interested in learning products, whether consumer or for classroom use. I thought I'd further break down these categories by age groups. For those of you who develop or work with kids, there are different developmental stages, and what is appropriate for a 5-year-old is not necessarily appropriate for a 13-year-old. And being aware of different age groupings is very helpful to determine your sweet spot of your target market. I intentionally included toddler preschool in one group for a slide I wanted to show next, and I imagine it might even be referenced in additional presentations to come today. This is one chart from a CUNY report by Carly Schuler, where it looks at where are the popular areas within, in this case, the Apple iTunes App Store. And the two comparison dates here are 2009 and 2011, where you see a huge growth in the early learning space. A little bit of activity in K6, more activity than 2009 in middle school, very little change in high school, and a decline in apps for adults. There's an awful lot of app activity and early learning products going on in the toddler preschool space. The market is very crowded. I've often said, where are the great learning games in the middle school and high school area? But I'll get into a little bit of that in just a moment, maybe why. But I think it's important to kind of show this chart just as kind of a background. Another really fantastic report to look at is a study by Common Sense Media with Vicki Rideout. Vicki Rideout creates probably the best research in the children's media space that you could find. And thankfully, she had just updated her media overview study of kids 0 to 8. And this, I pulled this chart in particular, though it is chock full of fantastic data. Look at how many kids 0 to 1 play games on a mobile device, 31%. Now, this is last year's data. This is a chart I saw over a decade ago, a company called Just Kid Inc. that talked about who's making the purchasing decision. At the time, not about apps, about anything that gets purchased in the home. That there's a flip at around 4.5 years old where a mom or a caregiver is making the purchase decision, and at about 4.5, it flips where the child is now influencing the purchasing decision. So when you look at that chart that I just showed you about how many early learning products are being sold in the iTunes App Store, those have to be parent-driven purchases or downloads. Okay, trends in apps. If you're unfamiliar with Destimo, they're a great app-related research company, and they dig into every different app market, app store, country, app type that you can imagine. And they just came out with a fabulous report in May, and I just pulled a few quotes here. As a category, games generate the most revenue compared to any other app store category. However, education is much more popular in the Apple App Store for iPads than compared to any other platform or device. Now, this is not a comment specifically about the Apple iTunes Store. It's about all stores. It's Google Play and it's Amazon, It's looking at all of them, and it's making some pretty strong recommendations about education specifically, gaming generally. In terms of monetization, the Apple iPad app prices tend to be higher, and as a result, the most revenue can be generated with an iPad app, as opposed to iPhone or Android or whatever. While downloads of educational apps are slightly less in the Apple App Store compared to other app stores like Google Play and Amazon and so forth, the revenue generated from educational iPad apps was higher by a factor of 3 to 10 times when compared to other app stores. So a majority of the revenue-making opportunity is specifically in the iPad app space. For those reasons, I thought those quotes just, they were burning right off the report pages. Industry and learning games. The three industries that I think are worth exploring with learning games, of course, one, the gaming industry, and there's been quite a lot of turmoil in the gaming industry related to revenue and where is it coming from, and one might argue that we have a number of aging consoles that are not helping the gaming industry much in terms of overall US sales. However, downloads are really the bright spot in the gaming space right now. And I think even with the upcoming Wii tablet, a lot of erosion has occurred for Nintendo, which is very strong in the kids space, not specifically strong in learning games. But downloads and apps, I think, will continue to be a very bright spot in the future for the gaming industry. So that's one industry. Another industry is the toy industry. The toy industry generates about $21 billion a year US. And much of the toy data, much like the video game data, comes from one research group called NPD. And if you're familiar with Anita Fraser, who covers that space in gaming and toys, she does some really great work. One of the interesting things about gaming numbers and revenues over the last few years is NPD keeps updating the way they calculate the numbers. So the way that the large 21 billion number tends to break out is in the form of what's called super categories. So action figures could be a super category, or outdoor playthings would be a super category. NPD had a category called learning and exploration, and that tended to be a lot of products like you might find from Leapfrog, or quite possibly the learning products from Fisher-Price. But more specifically, they were toys or electronic goods that were designed with learning in mind. A number of years ago, they removed the category. They restructured all super categories, so now you have electronics, you have games, you have creativity, but any one of those categories could include learning, and so you really can't tease out a number with today's stats. But what was noteworthy about the last time they ran these numbers, they said, exploration and learning, the category itself was greater than much of the traditional toy market, which talked about the possibility of revenue, and if you're looking to invest in new product development, that investing in learning games or learning related materials was the bright spot in the toy industry. Now take a look at another industry, the education industry. In the US, gaming is kind of a newer concept that educational publishers are starting to get comfortable with. If they're making games, they're making bad games. If teachers are buying games, they tend to look more in the consumer marketplace for games that have some word of mouth behind them, or something they may read about in the blogosphere from mommy bloggers or teacher bloggers. This is from a report that came out earlier this year called Project Tomorrow, where if we could design the school of tomorrow and we could have anything we wanted, what would we want? Well, one of the first things, no surprise, is we would like school-wide internet access. Surprisingly, games and simulations are on the list. And they break that out in terms of what principals want. Principals are interested in it. Parents a little less so in a school environment. Kids are like, yeah, I'm all for it. And these are middle school kids. There's also a lot of debate in educational publishing right now about the future of books and the future of e-books. Some states, like the state of California, in the way that educational materials are sold, has said we're no longer going to purchase physical books. All books we buy as a state will be digital. That's paving the way for a lot of devices to get into the classroom, a lot of possibilities for games to make its way into the classroom as well. Texas is also on the list. The way education is sold, it falls, whatever Texas, California, or Florida do, the rest of the country falls in line after that. And Texas is now debating about getting rid of textbooks as well. So I think all of that is good in the longer term future possibilities of learning games in the classroom. Now that I've covered the three major industries, let me jump back here just for a second. Some people every now and then say, well, why not the Android space? Why not the Nook space? Why should I not diversify my product offerings across multiple platforms? And I think there are smart ways of diversifying your portfolio for maximum revenue. And it does not have to be all just the iPad store. However, these are some trends I'm seeing. At Toy Fair in New York this year in February, there were 3 new tablets announced, and they were all Android-based, and they were all being positioned for kids as a toy product. Now, that's the Technosource product here, Lexibook, and Oregon Scientific. Each one had almost exactly the same specs. Each one was suggested retail price at the show of $149.95. So $149, you can get a reasonably powerful tablet as a toy. Fast forward to last month, one of the biggest educational conferences in the nation, called ISTE, was in San Diego, and this new tablet also emerged called Matrix 1. Exact same specs as the other 3 products, specifically being targeted to schools, $99. So what this tells me in the Android tablet space anyway, it feels like a race to the bottom. Whereas CES in January coming up in Las Vegas, what I'm expecting the news to be is $70 Android tablet, $59 Android tablet. That it's a race for the lowest possible cost from a hardware perspective. Is that good for gamers? Is that good for learning games? I think, schools and families will go like, wow, that's a really great price. I think I want that. Yeah, it's a lot cheaper than any iOS product. However, if you look at the stats, and this was another great quote out of the Stimo report, Google Play has the most free apps offered out of any other app store. And the flip side of that phrase is they also have the least amount of revenue generating opportunities. So if the consumer marketplace starts to invest heavily in Android-based tablets, and you as a game developer not only want to make games, but you also want to make learning games, you want to make a revenue stream. Well, there's a problem there that many people, at least according to some of the research, state that apps in the Android space are largely known as free giveaways, and how am I going to make money on recouping on my investment if I take that kind of approach? I'm not saying you shouldn't, it's just something you need to be aware of. If you're going for most free downloads, that's certainly a great path to go towards. Okay, I have a couple of tips related to development. People come to me quite often, and there'll be educational publishers or consumer companies and say, we want to make a play in another industry. We're an educational publisher and we want to play in the consumer marketplace. We're a toy company and we want to play in the classroom. And I say that's it's difficult for anyone to do. And of the few people who have, and I often point to Leapfrog, and there's plenty of good examples and bad examples within Leapfrog, the languaging is very different between the industries. First, in the consumer marketplace, think fun first, learning second. In the consumer marketplace, your product will not sell unless it is fun. In the classroom, while a product can be fun, there better be a lot of educational worthiness, appropriateness, integrity to the learning. And the phrasing, the marketing, the positioning behind each approach is vastly different. And you can't have just one common language and sell to 2 different markets. I have a number of tips if you're developing products for the classroom or for the consumer marketplace, and then I have some classroom-specific tips. I think it's really important to be specific with your audience. Don't say this game is for anyone from the ages of 3 to 300. Don't do that. Pick a spot, pick a sweet spot, and develop around those the cognitive abilities of your sweet spot. Make content developmentally appropriate. I personally think that apps or games that are more open-ended and free-form, sandbox-like apps, have greater appeal everywhere, classroom and consumer, but I also know the development costs involved in making games like that are pretty challenging. I have this theory that if you can hide the instruction, do so. Let a child explore and find and discover on their own what you're hoping they will discover, but make sure you test along the way that your assumptions are validated. But there's also, in early learning, there's this idea of, well, if a child wants to skip instructions, if you give audio instructions, should you allow that to happen? Some researchers say, yes, I want the child to have authority and autonomy, let them skip it. Others say no, they need to hear it. They need to hear it all the way to the end. I'm going to freeze all gameplay until instructions are done. I have a position personally what I think about that, but it's up to every individual. And there is conflicting evidence from a research perspective, in my opinion. This is more classroom specific. I find that noisy apps that burp, apps that fart, teachers aren't letting them into the classroom, even if they have really great educational value. Generally, they don't like branded characters. Anything that's noisy is a distraction in the class. So there has to be a way either A, to turn off the audio, or B, really think about your soundscaping when you're developing a product. And teachers like transparency. They like to know what's inside. Oftentimes I recommend making teacher materials as a PDF that they could download, that they could review through. A couple things here. I'm very cautious about too much praise. Everything a child does, that's right. You know, you get these sickly sweet, gosh, that's awesome. Boy, you're smart. You know, lighten up. You don't have to go so crazy with the praise. There is some evidence out there that it can do some damage by going overboard. Be aware of the language that you're using, you know, the words, the phrasing. It may need to be developmentally appropriate, correct for the age or grade. I have a real strong bias against beat the clock game mechanics. When I look at fabulous research by Carrie Heater and Brian Wynn out of Michigan State, they show that if you remove the timing element, kids learn just as well, if not better. But the timing mechanic really engages boys and not girls, but yet when boys engage in that kind of mechanic, they actually learn less. I also feel that leaderboards, I often recommend from a learning perspective, competing against your best score instead of everyone in the class, because there's some people in the class you may never be able to beat in a public forum. So I often say just beware of that. And I just put this in right before I came over today. I'd forgotten there is a code of ethical guidelines for publishers who make products for children. It's a work in progress that's worth checking out. I think they have some really great points within it. Anyway, I have a number of other things to share, but I'm just going to jump to the end. If you'd like to read my points, I'll make this presentation available from my Facebook page, and I know the conference organizers are going to make it available as well. When I look at the opportunities for learning games, I see so many opportunities across multiple industries. I also know there are easy traps to fall into to make common mistakes that are easily avoided. And as I mentioned, it's not just within the consumer space of toys or gaming, but also education. This is also a hot area of growing research, that many people are looking at learning games in research, many people are looking at apps and media and tablets. And what does that mean? That there's a lot of new stuff on the horizon coming out that could also help further enhance the future of learning games as an industry. And just my final thought, think about the child, think about the parent, think about the teacher through the development process, through the selling process. Be honest, be true, don't overhype. Don't overmarket, try to do no harm. And those are the comments I was looking forward to sharing with you today. Like I mentioned, many more, and thank you very much for your time.